Let's go. The threats are queen takes knight, queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are queen to e4, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen takes knight, rook to e1, queen to f3, check. Queen takes queen, knight takes queen. Another puzzle. The threats are pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop, queen takes knight, queen takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, bishop takes rook. The checks are queen to d2, check. Queen to e1, check. Knight to d3, check. Answer to this puzzle is bishop takes rook, knight to d5, pawn takes bishop, knight takes bishop, king takes knight. Next, the threats are queen takes pawn, queen takes knight, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to h8, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes pawn, pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn, check. Rook to f7, bishop takes pawn, knight to f6, queen to g4, rook to d7, queen takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are queen to b4, check. Queen to d3, check. Queen to e1, check. Queen to d1, check. Queen to c1, check. Queen to c2, check. Queen to b2, check. Queen to a2, check. The answer is queen to d1, check. King to a2. Queen to c2, check. Queen to b2. Queen takes queen, checkmate. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. Rook takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. Rook to b8, check. Rook to c8, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to c8, check. King to f7. Queen takes knight, check. g6. Queen to h7, check. Let's continue. The threats are queen takes rook, check. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Checks in this position are bishop to g8, check. Bishop to g6, check. Bishop to f5, check. Bishop to e4, check. Bishop to d3, check. Bishop to c2, check. Bishop to b1, check. Queen to g7, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to f6, check. The best move in puzzle position is bishop to f5, check. King to g8. Bishop takes pawn, check. Let's continue. Threats in this position are queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is bishop takes knight. King takes bishop. b3. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. Rook takes queen. Another one. The threats are queen takes rook, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, check. The answer is queen takes rook, check. Bishop to f8. Bishop to c5. Another one. Threats in this position are queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The checks are queen to g7, check. Queen to f8, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen to h8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen takes rook. Queen to d4, check. King to h1. One more. The threats are pawn takes knight. The checks are bishop to h2, check. Answer to this puzzle is pawn takes knight. Queen to b5. Bishop to c6. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is bishop to d4. Bishop takes bishop. Queen takes knight. Another one. The threats are queen takes knight. The checks are rook to h7, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. f4. Knight to d7. Rook to h7, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. Here are the checks. Rook to f8, check. The answer is rook to h8. Rook takes pawn. Rook to h7, check. King to e6. Rook takes rook. Let's continue. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. King takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to b3, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to b3, check. King to h8. Queen takes knight. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are pawn takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Pawn takes knight. Pawn takes pawn. King to h8. Another puzzle. The threats are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is king to c6. Knight to d4, check. King to b7. Knight takes bishop. King takes pawn. f5. King takes pawn. g5. King to c7. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to e8, check. Bishop to e6, check. Rook to e7, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to e8, check. King to g8. Bishop takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. King to h2. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are knight to d7, check. Knight to h7, check. Rook to d8, check. Answer to this puzzle is knight to d7, check. King to g7. Knight takes bishop. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are pawn takes rook. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are e2, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to d1, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes pawn, check. King to g1. Pawn takes rook. Next, the threats are pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to h8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook to h8, check. King to f7. Queen to h5, check. g6. Queen to h7, check. Knight to g7. Pawn takes pawn. Let's continue. The threats are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is king to f3. King to d2. King to f2. Another one. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to e8, check. Rook to g7, check. Bishop takes bishop, check. The answer is rook to e8, check. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes bishop, check. King to g7. Bishop takes rook. Another puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is rook to f6. Knight takes rook. Pawn takes knight. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is bishop takes knight. Knight takes bishop. Queen takes knight. Let's continue. The threats are rook takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Queen takes bishop. Checks in this position are knight to f6, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.